Hello, and welcome to Supply Chain Next. I'm your host, Richard Donaldson. Join me as we explore the ongoing evolution of supply chain, from the challenges practitioners face every day to the ongoing digital transformation of the entire value network. All right, and welcome to the next episode of Supply Chain Next. And I am ecstatic here to have two of the senior members from formerly of Maersk, and who have now, and I love this name, ventured off to start their own investment firm. We'll call it a VC private equity, but Project Aviato, which I'm giggling already because my first question is going to be about Silicon Valley. So real pleasure to welcome you guys, Sune and Peter, to the episode today. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'm gonna kick in before we even get into backgrounds. Both you guys got to tell me the story behind Project Aviato, because if you guys are Silicon Valley episode watchers, that was a great name. Or how did that come about?
That's been my contribution so far, I guess. But you're absolutely right, Richard. It is a Silicon Valley, the HBO series reference, and I like the way you said it, Aviato. Just the way like the Erlich Bachmann used to say it, and of course this is not what our fund is going to end up being called. This is we're very specific. It's Project Aviato, so this is the working title, and then over the next couple of weeks and months here we're going to launch a more formal name. But I think that one of the things about this particular TV series, not so much Aviato, is that it actually, for those of your listeners who are not and viewers who are not familiar with the TV series, it sort of goes through all these different stages of what it means to be a startup, and everything from trying to find your product market fit to trying to raise venture capital, to going bust, and having your tech not work and then it works, and then all the big evil corporates and I think and then of course it's heavily characterized, but I mean it's. I think sort of it's a very sort of interesting insight. I mean, my wife has no venture capital experience, and I initially forced her to sit down and watch the first two episodes with me. But then she actually got into it and watched it and was like, oh, that's what you're doing, right? So for those of you out there who have a spouse who's maybe not exposed to venture capital, and that's one way of educating them at least.
Yeah, I'm giggling here as Peter is too, and that's a great summary of it. And as someone who has spent 25 plus years, although I just recently moved to Arizona, but 25 years in Silicon Valley, that show was frighteningly on point with all of, we as a startup could pick characters and say, well, that's so-and-so or that's so-and-so. It was spot on through the whole thing. So it's a cool name, and it's going to, even if that spins into your branded sort of VC/PE firm, it's just a great way. You've endeared a number of startup people to you already through the choice of that name. So let me flip back around and get to sort of the meat of both you guys, right? Would love to just get a little introduction. You guys can pick out who wants to go first, but the two of you have just amazing backgrounds. Would love to hear a little bit about that, and clearly we're going to get into what prompted you all to form up and go after investing in supply chain. But we'd love to hear kind of how you got started and the history there, because it's really rich.
Yeah, thanks. Let me try to take a stab at that. You could say, I mean, Sune and I, we've known each other since 1999, where we both, as young, hopeful students, or finished after our respective school or a little bit of work, started in Maersk, and we started the so-called MISA program back then. And you could say then kind of followed each other a little bit in the beginning, and then I stayed within the logistics and Maersk traditional world, where Sune ventured a little bit off, and I'll let him talk a little bit more about that. So I've spent very much and most of my time in different leadership roles around the Maersk space and around the world, from running different countries to running customer service, but especially the last 6 to 7 years has been very much centered around transformation. Initially transforming, you could say, and leading the revenue management and optimization piece of Maersk. So you could say digitizing how you do pricing in an old shipping carrier. I think historically, people who know this industry, it was very much gut-based. It was very much based on, hey, let me call my friend in Rotterdam, let me call my friend in Shanghai, and there you go, then you have a rate. Into, you could say, a more sophisticated, data-driven decision. And then latest, you could say the last 2.5, 3 years has been around the overall transition from being a oil and energy as well as a logistics conglomerate into becoming, you could say, the global integrator of container logistics was within the sphere that I was working as the head of transformation. So that's very much what I've been up to. And then we can talk a lot more about why Aviato in a second.
Yeah.
But I'll let
yeah. Yeah, that's a great background. And before we shift over to Sune for a second, and your perspective, I mean, first of all, it's a testament to the two of you guys that you've known each other that long and are still together and chatting and smiling at each other. So clearly you guys get along, so that works. But then secondly, and I also want to kind of make sure that we also spend a little bit of time in this one, because I think it's fascinating. I know I don't want to ask about specifically within Maersk, but Maersk is a company that, you know, is in the world one of the key foundational elements of the world's supply chain. Yet most people who aren't in shipping or logistics don't necessarily, they see the Maersk ship running around, you know, and I drive into the San Francisco Bay, I kind of see Maersk in a ship, and that's interesting. But I don't think people realize it's a 150-year-old company. It's the largest by, you know, owning global market share around 70% in shipping of the top 20, which is pretty much, that's the whole world right there. Like Maersk itself is an interesting case study in, you know, longevity and itself maintaining its role in where it is, because it easily could have been displaced at some point. And it's a lot more than just a shipping company, and it wants to be, and it sees that. I mean, can you just take a second or two and just talk a little bit just about high level, you know, Maersk as a company? Because I don't think most people realize that. It's going to bring more value to kind of how you are looking at what I think spins out Project Aviato as we get to that.
No, absolutely. I mean, Maersk is a fantastic company, and as you say, it's been around since 1904. So longevity it certainly has, and it has built a terrific company. And as you said, initially built around a number of pillars. Traditionally a shipping company, then moved into oil in the 70s. Built up an oil conglomerate, including drilling activities, tankers, as well as its container business. And then back in 2016 embarked and decided on becoming the global integrator of container logistics, which is the journey that Maersk is on now. And there are many people who are now better equipped at Maersk that can tell you a lot more about that journey. But there's certainly, I mean, Maersk has proven time and time again through history at being very innovative in its approach, being very adaptable to changing environments and jumping on the trends. And as you say yourself, I mean, it's present all around the world. I mean, you can see the containers everywhere. You can see its reach, and the way you usually think about it when you go down in a shop and buy something. I mean, there's a high likelihood that it moved in a Maersk container or one of the other global carriers. So I mean, I utmost respect for Maersk, and it's given me 21 fantastic years. So I have a lot of respect for Maersk.
So, and it is a side note, I'm going to come back to Sune in a second, but you make me think of a company like Cargill, right? Which most people don't even know what that is. But it's like the largest privately owned company, you know, in the world, because go back and forth with, you know, Bechtel or something like that. But I remember I did a brief stint at Cargill way long time ago in Geneva of all places. And ironically was in oil shipping of all things at that time. But the key stat that we said is, you know, of the global supply chain, and I would think this of Maersk, like I'm just saying, if they own 17% of the shipping, you know, if you think about all the products in your daily life, Maersk has probably touched 95% of those. So everything in the personal consumer space, right, has somehow, some way come across Maersk in some way, shape, or form, and people don't even realize that. They think FedEx or UPS or DHL, but behind the scenes, you know, 2 or 3 steps is Maersk making all this happen, and most people don't realize that their entire home, if you look at everything, 90% of it, Maersk has touched in some way, shape, or I would think that's sort of one of those key kind of fun factoids they would throw out there. Yeah.
Has global reach, no doubt about it.
Yeah, totally cool. Okay, enough of that. So let me, and I knew this was going to be hard. So let me try and maybe maintain the. So Sune, let's talk a little bit about your background and history, and how because you also followed a slightly different, or you and Peter diverged a little bit through your tenure at Maersk, getting into different things, and then kind of leading into where we are now.
Yeah, we needed some time apart.
Right.
So I mean, as Peter mentioned, right? I've been Maersk for 21 years, and sort of first 10 of which sort of in a pretty, let's call it, traditional Maersk career path. With a lot of different jobs and a lot of different functions and a lot of different places of the world, being exposed to the shipping and transportation business. And then I made a choice or a career decision to move into more MD and CEO positions, typically in emerging markets and some pretty radical turnaround situations. The last two companies I was the CEO of was with the mandate to go in and turn the business around and then divest of it. I did that once in Latin America. I did it once in the Middle East. And then in mid-2016, Peter mentioned that Maersk at that point in time decided, and I think maybe what Peter didn't mention is that at one point in time when we both joined the company, we joined a very, very heavily diversified conglomerate. One is the shipping activities that Peter spoke about, the oil and gas activities, but we're actually also involved in industrial production, retail, banking, all sorts of stuff, right? So I think, the saying back then used to be that in Denmark, you never had to leave Maersk, right? We could go to the office and we could do our banking and we could do our shopping and, well, I don't know what else you need, but, and, then gradually sort of, been divesting of some of those activities. And I was sort of part of that last leg, if you will, the energy businesses. We divested of around $15 billion worth of revenues. And Peter mentioned this, the integrator of container logistics, Søren Skov, at that period in time became the CEO of Maersk in mid-16. A few months after this, he invited me to Copenhagen to have a chat and speak about his ambition and his strategy for Maersk going forward. And one of the things we spoke about was the whole area of adjacent growth. And long story short, in early 2017, I was then made responsible for the adjacent growth agenda for Maersk at the enterprise level, which eventually became what today is known as Maersk Growth, which over a 3-year period went from having no right to play in the venture space to becoming the world's most active supply chain investor. So over a 30-month period of time, we made 23 first-round financings in supply chain startups in the US and Europe primarily, and an additional 10 financing rounds in those companies. And pretty much any month the last 3 years, we've seen around 100 global supply chain startups, and then statistically invested in one of those. So that's essentially what I've been up to the last 21 years.
Well, that's a good summary. I love I use this sort of confident humility that you project, because clearly that's a lot of amazing experiences that most people don't get to have, right? Not only being at a global behemoth, but then getting to do those turnarounds, which where I'm going to lead to is you also have a third partner who's not here, another Peter. And when I look at the three of you, forming up Project Aviato, clearly, from my vantage point, I look at Peter here today as really having like hardcore kind of supply chain, operational logistics in the weeds of it. You soon seem to have more of that high level CEO kind of view, hands dirty with actually turning companies around. You bring, unlike a lot of venture capitalists in Sand Hill Road, you actually have real operational experience in running companies. What does it take to actually do that versus just put money into it? And then your third partner, maybe the two of you can chime in on, brings kind of that third leg to the stool where he was really leading management consulting practices, which is another piece of the puzzle. When you put the three of you together, I mean, that's a powerful team of not just investment insight and foresight, but operational experience that you can bring to your future portfolio companies.
and then maybe I'll kick that off, and then Peter, I'm sure you'll chime in, right? But I think you're absolutely right around that, Richard, right? And the other Peter, he's out doing some real work while we're sitting here shooting the breeze. So,
Right.
but I think you're absolutely right that when we look at how we're trying to differentiate ourselves, right? I mean, there's clearly something around our investment thesis, right? That when we look at who's investing in supply chain today, you have a couple of, I would say, very competent early stage investors doing pre-seed and seed, typically one or two men, it's typically men, bands who are investing in supply chain, very deep, very thoughtful, but either does not have the ability and or the interest to raise something larger. Then you have a lot of the generalist, named brand funds who are also investing in supply chain, but typically with a very, very low degree of expertise within the supply chain space. So we've identified both a knowledge gap and a funding gap between that, let's call it A rounds, up to late B, early C, maybe D, where we believe that actually our knowledge and our experience and our network really comes into play. And we believe very, very firmly in that operator model. So, I mean, not to step on anybody's toes, but we believe, particularly in supply chain, we believe that operators will beat financial investors. And now, of course, you and everybody else knows Peter and me, and we complement each other well, right? As you say, Peter comes with this, very strong industry view and industry experience, having been at the cusp of the transformation of the industry. Maersk has been the driver behind a lot of these industry transformations over the year. And Peter has been participating in these waves and have been driving a lot of the waves. I've had the benefit, both, as you say, the CEO and man director roles, but also the last 4 years, I've been very exposed to the venture industry, the leading startups, the leading investors, and having seen more than 3,000 startups, right? I mean, you begin to have a pretty good idea of what does good look like, in addition to getting that network. So I've had this, let's say, outside in view on what's happening and what's really sort of happening at the grassroots. And then, of course, we have Peter, who was with me at Maersk Growth, where he was our head of value creation. So we are very structured, we are very process oriented. We believe that we're trying to build something that scales. So Peter, together with me, the other Peter, has seen a lot of these startups, but also comes with a sort of, from his consulting background, a very sort of structured and process view of the world. And that's our complementary skill sets. But on top of that, we also have, let's say, quite a few team members, TBA, who haven't made the leap yet. We are full on this opportunity, but who also actually further both complement us, but also people that we know and can work in this certain way, right? I mean, and I'll get off my soapbox in just a second, but I think the basic point here is that when we're looking at venture capital, I think one of the things that's been surprising to us is that it's typically played as a very individualistic sport. So most funds are, let's call it, franchises of one, or individual franchises centered around an individual, whereas we are really trying to turn venture capital into a team sport where we complement each other, we leverage each other, and we believe that with the right processes becomes scalable.
Yeah, and I think the only thing you left out, Sune, which I think also complements it, is apart from you could say the standing team within the fund that we're looking at, it's also a very wide variety of expert network, both in corporates, obviously through our backgrounds and my background, also dealing with a lot of these, many negotiations, many interactions with them, but also an expert network who are truly experts within the whole supply chain space. When you're a captive VC, you sometimes are limited to, you could say, what in this case Maersk has to offer, whereas now we have an ability to actually expand that dramatically and really leverage the experts within. And that's what Sune is also alluding to when he says we see it truly as a win-win-win. So a team sport across, where I may not be the best suited as GP to be on a board of this company because for this specific, I don't bring the expertise. They're not at a space where I can add value right here now. I may see the potential, but someone else in the expert network or Sune or one of the others in the team would be able to leverage and really add value to that company where it is in its stage. And I think it's a little bit of a shift mindset, but it's really important for us to get that across, is that that's what we want to stand for. We want to drive value for the companies that we invest in. It's really, really close to heart.
Yeah, no. I think you guys have nailed it. And there's so much that you said, both of you, in that summary, because in one sense, there's the journey that you've gone through as being a part of a major enterprise that opened up an investment arm. And that's a lesson unto itself, because not all enterprises can make great investors. That's a lesson we've learned, and I get you guys have learned firsthand. Then next is which we're going to get into, is actually this whole, what we've called the decade of supply chain, right? If you go back and look at a long enough timeline, over the last 20 or 30 years, a lot of the investments have investments, when I say investments, I'm saying just globally, have really been driven at the internet, the infrastructure, the consumers. Big businesses and enterprises haven't really jumped in until now with, driving the need for investment in the space, right? There's been a little bit in sales and marketing with the sales forces and things like that. But there's two big pieces of the enterprise space from our vantage point, or mine in particular, that I see as opening for disruption. Supply chain is the number one, obviously, we're going to talk about that, but also there's finance, right? I mean, I think SAP sitting there owning that little financial beachhead is ripe for disruption in this next decade, because it has not changed much. That's my own critique, but it's a massive space, and enterprises, as we know, tend to be very risk averse. So the two things they don't want to touch in their business are the supply chain and finance, right? But we're seeing now the supply chain investment happening almost by necessity, because you can't live anymore with this dichotomy between my consumer persona, which I can see my toothbrush where it is when I order it until it's delivered to my door. But when I order $100 million of things in my supply chain in the enterprise, I have no idea where it is till it shows up. Oftentimes, right? And so people just, that gap is so wide now that it has to be addressed. So where I'm going to come back to is really what I would focus a little bit on is just your experiences in even getting ventures going at a large behemoth like, and it's not just Maersk, but at an enterprise, because that's also a unique thing. There's a lot of companies, specifically, we as a company were, invested in by Worley. So we were kind of in the early of their adventures in anything. How did that go? How did the experience of just kind of driving innovation and investment at a large enterprise, how was that as an experience for you two? And then how did that lead you to now saying, ooh, I want to go do this on our own? And then that's going to get us into kind of the Aviato and moving forward. But, focusing on just, the experiences there. Yeah, go ahead.
I'll definitely be happy to speak a bit about that. And then I think maybe just picking up quickly on your point about, finance and supply chain, we actually don't see those as being exclusive, right? I think they're actually an integrated part. I mean, coming back also to your point earlier, Richard, you mentioned Cargill, right? And I think when you look at some of these very large commodity traders and commodity companies, right? I mean, that's clearly, how do you actually manage your inventory, your value, your stock on the water and your cash flows and all of these things. And we definitely think that's a big, I think, and you can start looking into manufacturing, which people also see as something separate from supply chain today, right? But these pieces, of course, become more and more interconnected, right? I mean, you've done some great write-ups on digital twins, for instance, and how do you start sort of playing around with some of these things, and how does these worlds come together? Because you can't make decisions over here without factoring in the consequences at the other end of the spectrum. Anyhow, there's a little bit of a sidestep from your question, but I thought it's an important point you made. I think, in nature, I guess that, Peter mentioned it before, Maersk has, as a company, been very brave for 120 years, and I think, very innovative on a lot of different fronts, right? And I think that certainly in the shipping industry, I think that Maersk has been leading the pack, right? But certainly there's something about, on a more general level, inherent to being a listed company, but also, of course, just to being a corporate. And when you are working in a corporate, how are you being incentivized? What are you working for? And so on. And I think one of the things we clearly observe, and which has been one of the motivators for us to go out and pursue this opportunity, is that we are seeing not only the supply chain players, you know, the retailers, the brand owners, and so on. I mean, a lot of them are stuck with a relatively archaic infrastructure, an IT backbone, and so on. And of course, if you're kind of sitting with this, and this is what you are used to, and you are heavily invested in this, it's a pretty big decision actually to change that, right, and make a departure from that. And I just think there's just an inherent conflict there that's really, really, really difficult to solve, right? And I think it's also conversely very easy. And, you know, I've had this discussion with many startup founders or outsiders, right? Because clearly, I mean, when you're an outsider, you are, I don't know, a 25-year-old Stanford graduate, right? You know, and, you know, smart people looking at our industry would be sitting and saying, you know, I mean, are these guys idiots? Right. And I think there's sort of, you know, I don't think that people, or the average person, at least in shipping, is not an idiot by any means. There's some really, really smart and really, really driven people in supply chain. But you're coming from an industry that's so complex, you know, both from an operating perspective and from a regulatory perspective, with so many interconnected parts, right? That changing that is not done overnight, and it cannot be done by a clever app, you know, where you slide right and left, because, you know, you might create the world's most wonderful, you know, tech solution, but there's also physical stuff that has to move, right? And I think sort of marrying those two worlds, I think is really, really, it's a really, really difficult challenge, just for the industry as a whole, right?
Yeah, totally. And I think so building on that, let me double click on that for a second and go back to sort of the enterprise experience. I mean, you've touched on a number of, you know, key factors, right? One is the size and breadth of the global supply chain, right? Its sheer size is its complexity. Because one of the things is supply chain onto its own. On a piece of paper, I can tell you what supply chain does. It buys and manages and sells assets. There you go. There's supply chain, right? That's my 101 course. Now, how you do all that is massive, though, right? There's so many piece parts that have been around and embedded for decades and decades and decades. And there's a online and offline component that have to be thought of in supply chain, not like just building a social network where I'm just, you know, doing a Facebook spinoff or something like that, right? So that's another one. And then also, as you know, we you know, when I talk to some of these other people who've been thinking about supply chain forever, it is like the central nervous system of the enterprise. So it's like doing spinal surgery, right? You don't want to do it unless you really have to. And for most people, it's not really broken. So they're like, well, why do I want to do chiropractic care for my enterprise, right? Like that kind of scares me, right? I don't want to have a stuck back or something like that. So anyway, so let me go back to the enterprise for a second, because I think it's fascinating that you guys also spend time with 3,000 some odd, you know, views. You know, what are the things that you learned coming out of, you know, your initial foray into enterprise investing that then made you want to go do this on your own? What were some of the constraints? You know, what were the positive aspects of it? And then maybe the constraints that prompted you to say, you know what, there's a bigger thing for us to go do and launch Project Aviato.
Do you want to take a first stab at that, Peter?
No, I can, and I think it's never easy when you leave a company after 21 years. Let me put it that way.
Right.
No matter how you twist and turn that.
Right.
But I think you could say, as a little bit Sune was alluding to, when you're in a corporate VC setup, and Sune has a good story of saying how he tried to explain to Søren as to what it was and how investments in startups works over time, and maybe didn't manage to give the full essence of saying, well, when you make some good bets, you want to try to follow on those bets throughout the period.
Right.
And Maersk as a conglomerate is a very big piece of business. So the deals, when you're talking seed and Series A rounds, are small in the grander scheme of things, right? And I think at some point you make a strategic decision as to where do you want to take and how do you want to become, in Maersk's case, the global integrator of container logistics. And you can follow many paths. And in our case, our thought process was, could we do that through a Maersk growth setup that was more independent or not. And I think in the end, we just saw there was a space outside that Maersk did not want to pursue. That we said, well, then we see that this, what the space we talked about before is still very much there. And by putting together the right team, we can operate in that space. And that's also been a very open dialogue all along, you could say, throughout our Maersk departure.
Sure.
I don't know if that explains it, Sune. I mean, we can add more flavor to it, but I think that's the way I see it.
I think the only thing I might want to add to that is that clearly, I mean, when you're part of a captive venture setup, right? I mean, that of course comes with certain constraints, and who can you work with and what can you work on, and it has to sort of fit the strategy and so on. And I think we just collectively within our team here feel that there's a very, very big opportunity. We really believe that this decade, and then you mentioned that to us before, Richard, right? That we really believe that this decade is very much about supply chain, right? And I think when you look at, we clearly also been looking at some of the historical aspects of venture capital. The 80s and the 90s, and then you had emergence of software as a service, and then 80s were hardware, and then so on and so forth, right? And now we are really beginning to see technology beginning to move back into the physical world, if you will, and those two worlds coming together. We believe that supply chain is going to be one of the major areas affected by this. And so kind of the opportunity is now. And, we want to be part of this. Well, actually, maybe just let me be a little bit less humble about it. We want to be at the center of this. Both because of the impact this is going to have on the world and on an industry that we are quite passionate about. Both from just how do you move stuff and and tying into consumer behavior, but also all the inefficiencies that you're looking at in the industry and the potential environmental impact of addressing some of these things, right? We want to make sure this happens, and we kind of believe that the best way for us to make a real big dent in the universe is if we are, let's say, if we are unchained. And this is essentially why we decided to go after this opportunity on our own.
Well, as you were talking soon, in my head, all of a sudden I started creating a sort of a chart, which would be fascinating to see, which would be how technology has been adopted decade over decade, and what were the thrusts of those decades. Because I think you were key in saying, and very insightful in saying, the 80s were about hardware, 90s kind of shifted into the sort of internet propagation and enthusiasm led by consumers. The 2000s, 20 to 2010 was really kind of the rise of the consumerization of everything. 2010 to 2020, and again, I'm just talking aloud right now, kind of that represented sort of this, doubling down on all that consumerization. And then all of a sudden you get to 2020 and we're shifting, as you put it, back into the enterprise a little bit, right? The enterprise has kind of stood on the sidelines for these last couple decades, waiting to see how things were going to play out. Now we're shifting back to them. And you could begin to go, well, all of a sudden, the enterprise starts getting digitized this decade. Probably the following decade, you might look at starting, the human beings and the high touch when we start thinking about medical and pharmaceutical and things like that. Like it's, I mean, I don't know if you intended to do that, but there's a wonderful view of decade over decade technology adoption. And we just happen to be right at the epicenter of supply chain adoption.
I mean, in our pitch material, it's a couple of bullets. We haven't made a fancy chart yet, but we'll be working on that.
Well, hey, there you go. So that's the outcome of this conversation. Is there's a very cool chart.
We'll give you credits underneath.
It's all good. Well, let's shift back into why supply chain. Why now? We're all three here in violent agreement, right? The decade of supply chain, what's going on. But now let's talk about Project Aviato and how you guys are really viewing. So clearly, it's investment in supply chain. Clearly, it's a hybrid between traditional venture capital and private equity. I think you guys have touched on that, but that's a key attribute to this where, it's not quite venture capital in what Sandhill Road thinks about. It's not quite what private equity like a Kohlberg Kravis thinks about, but it's somewhere in the middle. And ironically, I think also with private equity is supply chain, because it's so enterprise focused, tends to actually fall into their portfolio optimization plays more than it would a traditional VC, which is another characteristic of private equity. But let's talk about, again, this gap, the vision for Project Aviato, and specifically, what is it within supply chain that you guys are kind of beginning to earmark as the, thesis of the investments that you're looking at? It could be logistics, it could be payments, it could be asset flows. Like, how are you guys kind of viewing all this as of right now?
Do you want to, Peter, or you want me to kick it off?
Go ahead.
Take a step. I'll jump at it.
Add to it.
That's fantastic. So I think, to us, I think it really, really begins with the customer, right? And it begins also with a real customer problem. I think that there are, well, and this is something we share, that there are too many companies out there, and this is not only in supply chain, who are, let's say, technologies or solutions looking for a problem. Or companies out there that are being launched and being funded to essentially make a pretty web page. And nothing wrong with that, but we really, really like, let's say, companies that solves real problems, right? The next level for us is then when you're looking at how the world is changing, and we could probably hold, a separate seminar on this, but everything from, you spoke about consumer behavior before, Richard, right? I mean, what does, how does consumer behavior change, and what impacts does that have on the supply chain, right? It's everything from the Amazon effect to the thing that, you want, your Nike sneakers to be a little bit different than mine, right? So you want it to be customized. By the way, you want them tomorrow, not in 3 months. You probably also want to return them, and all of these things. How does that happen, right? And you want to make sure that these sneakers have been made, under proper working conditions. And, you want them to be CO2 neutral and all of these things, right? That puts a massive strain on a system that's already not particularly efficient, and a system that already is suffering from a lot of friction. And now you start exponentially adding to that complexity, and you're moving to units of one, not of one container, but to one box of shoes or one t-shirt, right? And lining all of these things up is clearly some of the things that, we like companies that solve real problems, and often those are also hard problems, right? Yep. And also, I mean, to be frank, there's a lot of people who can come in and solve marginal problems. They probably have to find other investors, because we don't really believe in that as a venture case, right? Right. I think that maybe the easiest way, and a slightly different angle on this is, of course, coming from Maersk, a lot of people think, we're going to go after ocean freight or that space. But, frankly, that's one of the things we're definitely not going to go after, because we actually believe that the carriers have done a fantastic, including our previous employer, an amazing job at optimizing that. So that's not where the battle is going to be won. It's much more in looking at that, you spoke about it before, and then you've written some stuff about it as well, right? That this, B2C versus B2B, mm-hmm. which people sort of from a logistics perspective are used to look at separate. That doesn't really work out right. So manufacturing cannot be different from supply chain, and B2B supply chains cannot be different from B2B. They somehow have to communicate. Right. And those are some of the things that we historically have invested in, and also will be investing in going forward. Yep, fair. What did I leave out in that of interesting aspects?
No, but I think you touch upon it very well. I think one of the things we keep saying, and you allude to it, it is that colossal amount of waste that still sits in the system, and there are true problems to be solved. But we've also built an industry where there is no clear accountability of the end-to-end supply chain. Everybody has their own way of optimizing along the way, which always results in a bad outcome. And then you have industry players, you could say incumbents, who live off the opaqueness as a business model. And fundamentally, there are some things around collaboration that we've talked and spent quite some time discussing is, I think we'll start seeing that shift in, like you've seen in other industries, where you start collaborating much more around standards. How do you look at this? Because I mean, just getting one EBL. I mean, I think DCSA, who we're very strong supporters of, just came out saying we finally agreed amongst the big carriers. This is the standard for an E below lading. Come on, guys, right? It's fantastic, and we want it. But I think we're gonna see an acceleration in that area that lends itself well to some of these solutions, because it's been one of the prohibitors. Because a lot of people have been saying now there's going to be supply chain solutions. It's coming, it's coming, it's coming. But because of the complexity, because of the lack of industry standards, we've always been left, then we have to make some of these, what Sune calls subpar solutions, that take away a little bit of it, but doesn't really fundamentally solve the underlying problem, what the customer is after. And that's the space that we're super keen on getting into and helping along the way. And then using, back to the team sport analogy, using all players in the industry to make this better, right?
Right.
And sorry, Richard, but you just triggered something there, Peter, right? I mean, some of the stuff that Peter and I've been working on that, so Peter, for instance, has been on the board and invested in NICEX when we were still with Maersk, right? Which is essentially addressing the problem of, I book space, but I don't, I decide whether I use it or not and whether I pay for it or not, right? So, I mean, essentially contract compliance, which most other industries would sort of take for granted, right? I mean, you probably couldn't imagine that, you booked a, vacation flight, right? And you kind of, decide whether you show up or not, and the airline never really knows, right? I mean, so I think it's just one example, right? And I've been very heavily involved in the early parts of TradeLens, which I and my team incubated, and same thing, right? I mean, having some standards about how do we communicate and what kind of platforms and what kind of systems, and then as Peter mentioned, DCSA is another great initiative. And I think today, some companies are harvesting value that probably really shouldn't be harvested. And so I think those initiatives that is going to level the playing field, and then companies can start competing on the stuff that really matters, a better customer experience, essentially, right? I think that's going to be pretty awesome. Also means that there are some players in the market today who are going to have a difficult time because, they've been benefiting for years and been building businesses on industry not being able to collaborate more, and we think that's going to change.
Absolutely, and I was gonna jump in one quick second because I want to be I knew this is, it always happens, and looking at this like 60 minutes is sometimes just not enough. Like literally the three of us, I could sit all day with you guys and talk through some things. So, but I also wanted to pick up on one thing because you mentioned Nike, and that's my poster child for enterprises that are transitioning from traditional retail consumer mindsets to technology companies through the hiring of their current CEO, John Donahoe, who used to be the CEO of eBay when I was there. And so it's a really fascinating pick where Nike is making a big bet in its leadership, saying we want to transition from just traditional consumer product company to a technology company, and even more to point, become a technology platform for healthy lifestyle living, right? Or at least that's how I'd interpret it. And I also want to touch on, so that's one side comment, but I also want to kind of dig into a little bit for your guys thinking, because, Peter in particular, you talk about standardization, right? Centralization. That's the key missing element in any of these cross communication requirements, especially in a supply chain. Whether I'm going from, raw materials through manufacturing, through OEM, through to consumer, just having a standard SKU run through that you'd think would be there, but doesn't exist, right? So the question here is, that's a key problem, standardization, right? Now, how you approach that, though, I think is also somewhat, I don't want to say ready-made, but, and you keyed on it a couple of times, but another thing is platforms, right? The role of platforms and how they are applied in this emerging space for these technologies, because platforms, by their very nature, funnel people into standardization, right? That's kind of one of their key attributes and benefits. So how do you view that? And I'm going to kick it to Peter first. How do you view that coming from your operational standpoint? Because I'm sure Maersk built stuff internally, but then you looking at now in future investing over these years, I mean, how do you view platforms is a key component to that, to bringing that standardization to bear, right?
But I see platforms as one way of you could say speeding that up, because as you say yourself, it's the one way where you can funnel enough into enforcing some of these standards. And Sune brought up NICEX. NICEX is a perfect example. Simple accountability that a contract is a contract, a two-way commitment. It's as basic as it gets, but it's still completely and utterly fundamental for the entire cargo flow. So I have belief that we will see more platforms that will help accelerate that. Then there are the industry standards, like we said, DCSA before. You have IATA in the flight industry. Why would you have something similar in a supply chain space? So and then I think you're going to have a number of aggregation layers where you have to translate, because standardization by nature just takes time. So you're going to have something with open APIs that can translate the information that comes into a usable format. But what you usually also start seeing is you start seeing prevalent standards coming out, and people saying, this is the way we start doing it. And then more and more start buying into that becomes the standard. And that's also what we're banking on. You could say that we're going to find those winners that say, this is as close as we can get. And then as soon as then let's start. It's almost like you have to democratize that whole piece. Just democratize supply chain, make it super easy, and then really, really start competing on what matters. And that's something about the customer, right? Something about building a better customer experience, or something like that. That's how I see it anyway. I don't know if you have anything to add, Sune.
No, you are our house authority and platform, so I have nothing to add.
Yeah, well, that's okay. Well, but I think that's a key attribute, though. So now, kind of, looking again now at where Project Aviato is. So, it sounds like you guys are still in the early formative stages. I don't know where if you're out soliciting funding, still building the team. But what's next for Project Aviato as you guys are kind of kicking off? How do people even begin? Are you guys even taking pitches at this point? What's the status of you guys in where you're at?
Yeah, so I mean, we, so Peter and I left Maersk at the end of 2020, and the hardworking Peter, he joined us a month later, so at the end of January. So I mean, as a 3-person team, I mean, we essentially 1.5 months into this journey. We had set the first 6 weeks of this year aside for learning. The first 3 months of this year aside for learning. Essentially going out, speaking with industry experts, both in venture and industry, and saying, okay, we have this idea. We think it's awesome. Now, we know that it's not perfectly honed, but why don't you help us make this story even sharper? And, we worked in corporate for many years, so we are used to beating ourselves to death and being very critical. So so quite a lot of challenges with our story and what we want to achieve and so on. Again, we fundamentally really believe in it and you see it as a real opportunity, but let's sort of try to find out how we hone this even better. And then we, and this is essentially what we did. But then during January and February, the feedback we've been getting from everybody is kind of like, this is fantastic. You are addressing the right problem at the right point in time, and guess what? You're also the right team to do this. So why don't you stop talking and start investing? And so it's this is kind of what we've been in the mode we've been in for a few weeks now. So we are out. We are preparing to fundraise. Our lawyer has a few documents he has to finish before we can officially start fundraising. But out and I mean, interest so far has been overwhelming, and we do sort of expect that within the next couple of weeks here we're going to move into, let's say, real fundraising mode. Conversely, this also means that we're not currently investing, but we are actually working on, let's say, a pipeline. Both the pipeline we brought with us from our time with Maersk. So companies we know, both companies we've invested in the past, but also company we, for whatever reason, were not able to invest in. And then we are continuing to get very significant deal flow in that we're looking at. And so we are quite eager to get to a first close on our fund, and then we can hopefully start backing some great founders. So very specifically on your question, we would love to hear from people. I mean, if anybody expects a bank transfer on Monday, well, then it either has to be a very small one, or we have to be able to pay in Bitcoin. But I mean, essentially, if there's companies out there sort of around this, looking at raising an A, over the next 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, we would love to hear from them. And then, we also spend a fair bit of our time just, helping founders. And this doesn't have to be within our sweet spot, but, within supply chain, but even without supply chain, sort of, sharing some of our experiences and trying to make them a little bit sharper. And this, of course, is stuff that we learn from. And, we love to help, and we are big believers in karma. So that's another, what normally happens when we do a podcast on interview is that then sort of our inboxes blow up. So
right.
It might be a day or two before we respond, but we do respond.
No, that's great. I don't know if Peter, if you want to jump in on that at all.
No, as I said, we're here to help, and Sune has described the process very well. But I just want to echo that. Just send it our way, and we'll be ready to talk about it.
Well, I think you actually might get 2 inbounds, right? So as I'm sitting here listening to both of you guys talk about this, I think there's a lot of enterprises trying to figure out how to invest in supply chain. So you're going to have a lot of enterprise fund participation, funding the fund, right? And I imagine your original employer has probably earmarked some there, but then you kind of go out to all these other ones. I mean, you got the Cargills, you got, even the Worleys, I mean, there's a lot, and there's just endowment fund. I mean, there's a lot of money that's going to want to play in what you guys are doing, right? Then of course
and I think,
yeah, go ahead.
And maybe just to add to that, Rich, and of course, this is we are being, we would love also hear from investors and LPs, obviously.
Yeah.
But I think sort of when we look at the people who are, pretty interested in what we're doing, I think you're absolutely right. I think there's some institutionals who would like that exposure, to the industry, because they're seeing it transforming, and they're seeing a potential for some very significant financial returns in this. So we're definitely seeing a very, very strong interest. So that's definitely an angle, right? That financial aspect. But of course, as you're saying, we would also really like to get a couple of strategic investors into Aviato, people who still want obviously the financial return, because this is finance first, right? But obviously we can also sort of see the value in getting those insights, right? And we do see a lot, and we are having those discussions, also on an advisor level with some pretty notable individuals and notable companies. But that would be great if we get hear both from startups and from potential investors.
Yeah, well, no, I was just listening to you guys. I mean, I'm just, again, the story sells itself. I mean, it's just, it's a simple story. You guys have direct experience at one of the biggest supply chain companies of the world. You led an innovation investment. I mean, your bona fides, sell themselves, right? So, and just like you said, it's like investing in crypto. A lot of people don't even know where to begin. So they're looking for experts to guide them through that investment. There's a lot of money out there looking to get into supply chain. Like you said, they just don't even know where to go, because your traditional Sandhill Road companies, VCs, they're not quite earmarked for this, and that's sort of part of the reason for this podcast / follow-on interview is, the investment area of supply chain is taking this, it's demanding something that sits between VC and PE. It's not the same as it used to be, right? It requires some operational insights. It requires reach into the supply chain industry, which is a Rolodex of enterprise contacts. It's not just an investment banker analyzing how I do a liquidity event with you, and I'm going to put my money in and expect it in 4 or 5 rounds to get my 10x. That's not how these supply chain investments are going to work. It's in that sense, it's more operational, like a PE firm. But again, PEs aren't ready to drop 1 to 2 to 3 million. They want to put 100 million to play, and so there's a big, there's this gap, and you guys are really right in the middle at the right time. I mean, we talk about this all the time. So I mean, it's so cool to see.
Very glad to have that validated, and that's obviously also one of the things that we have been getting that continuously validated the last couple of months, and I guess that there must be something to it then.
No, but I think one of the things we haven't stressed is also, I mean, this is not a one-time thing. It's not a one-time fund.
Right.
I mean, this is something that's going to be going on, and hopefully we're talking again in 10 years, right? And then we're at fund whatever number it's called at that time. I think it's about also building something that's lasting and that actually makes and generates a difference, because that's when we sat down and looked each other in the eye, Sune and I, we also said, I mean, this is not a play to make a quick buck, because first of all, it's tough, and then the odds are against us and all this, but second of all, it's because we believe and we love this industry, and we want to make a difference for a lot more than just this space. So I think I think our hope is to create that.
Well, I was going to say, as you were saying that, Peter, you know, it strikes me too, for both of you guys, or all three of you guys in particular, but you know, you, Peter and Sune today, is that, you know, as investors and as operators, not only are you investing to clearly make money for your LPs, but you're actually driving the world's global supply chain forward through investment, right? Operationally changing and making that, you know, inefficient global supply chain that we all recognize, especially coming out of the pandemic here, where people are talking all things supply chain. It's like, we've got to address this. I mean, the timing is now. And as investors, you're not just going in to make money, you're going in to have a social impact through your investment, right? Driving the ideas of sustainability, circularity, sourcing materials, you know, avoiding all the pitfalls of the things that you guys alluded to, which is, you know, unethical practices, unethical sourcing. I mean, that, you know, at the end of the day, when you step back and think about it, your involvement through investment is going to impact that aggregate global supply chain in an extremely positive way. So there's my marketing shtick for you guys to add into the Marcom materials.
Yeah. That sounds good. You could be our community manager.
Yeah, exactly. We'll send 3 bottles of wine over. No, and I think maybe just one point, Richard, that you just reminded me of, right? And I think, you know, you heard Peter speak about partnerships early on, right? And just you mentioned some of the more traditional VCs, you know, and you know, Sand Hill Road being a point in case, right? Again, I think a lot of these people are, of course, incredibly successful investors, very, very skilled people, very, very smart people. But I think one of the things we clearly seen is that, you know, I think starting maybe with a Flexport, right, you know, 5-6 years ago, they saw this massive addressable market, right, and jumped at it. And then they understood a little bit later on the complexities. And I think that's one of the things from our conversations over the last few years, is that a lot of these people we've actually forged some very, very deep relations with, because, you know, they see what we bring to the table, that deep sector expertise. But of course, they also have a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge and a lot of capability that we don't have, you know, the way that you sort of, you know, scale and so on. So we don't, you know, this is not for us sort of a, you know, it's either us or, well, you know, fund A, B, or C from Sand Hill Road. We really like that combination, and that's also the last, you know, many investments we did in a you know, in a Maersk growth context. We actually syndicated those with tier 1 VCs who had seen the value that we had created for the companies. They heard it from our founders. They saw our value creation model. They saw our expertise, and you know, and we fundamentally really believe that that's where the magic happens, right? We can't do this alone. But conversely, none of the other funds can do this alone. But when we come together, then we believe it becomes really, really powerful.
Yep, I think you keyed on another aspect. I wasn't even thinking of it too, but you also are going to be a source or avenue or pathway for these, I'll call them traditional tier 1 sandhill roads, the summits, the apexes, right? You know, that don't necessarily have the insight into supply chain enterprise investing. They'll view you as a vehicle to get in there and get smart, which is really cool. I mean, that's another, and a great bridge too.
Yeah, and I must say, Richard, right, and you know, nobody mentioned, nobody forgotten, but I think one of the things that I've been quite overwhelmed about, and also, you know, let's say a little bit touched about, is that, you know, after we left Maersk, of course, when you leave a company after so many years, you kind of you know, ask yourself a little bit your network. I mean, is it your network or is it the employer's network, and who do they really love, right? And I mean, they help and the assistance and the way that some of these very, very prominent people that you read about in all the magazines and so on, the way that they really have been leaning into Aviato and been helping us and supporting us and looking at saying, hey, we need this, right? And we need somebody to partner with, and we're gonna, whatever you need help with, this has just been really, really overwhelming. But of course, also, I think sort of validating that we are probably onto something.
Absolutely. So I'm gonna, and I normally don't do this, but I want to be conscious of time because, like I said, and I know, just awesome. I'm gonna wind up though, just to be conscious of the hour, your guys' time, and certainly the episode. But if it's okay too, want to check back probably in 6 or 9 months, because I think checking in as you guys have a chance to kind of get going and see the learnings and lessons would be a wonderful follow-on. But I mean, such a great day. You guys are amazing. I mean, the energy is great, and I knew this was going to be fun from the get-go. But I'm constraining myself because I want to keep going. So, but I am going to wind up here in a matter of time. But thank you so much for participating today. It's been really a wonderful experience.
Thank you so much for having us, Richard. We'll check in hopefully soon with an update.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
This is Richard Donaldson. Thanks for listening. If you have any comments about the episode or topics in supply chain you'd like us to explore, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach us at supplychainnext@requis.com. And while you're at it, why not check out the Requis platform at supplychain.requis.com. Requis allows you to manage the full asset lifecycle in the cloud, collaborating with your entire value network to buy, manage, and sell your assets. Find out more at www.requis.com.